Welcome, everybody, to this edition of Beers with Bill. It is my pleasure tonight to welcome Devin Huffman from Owl Malt. Devin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. Well, it's part of craft beer. The malt plays an important and critical role, and it's good for people to understand that process.
Sure.
So the four beers, which one did you want to start with tonight?
Oh, we can start. Right?
I lucked out because I actually had one of the McKinnon Pilsner in my cellar. So,
right. Yeah. Well, I'm missing the left field. I do have the other three. Well, we can start with the Pilsner if you want. Then the brothers, Lamina. That's yeah, one of the ones I put on that list just because this was I mean, not only is it a single malt we did all the processing for, but it's also the first we've been working on sort of variety trials for the last few years in terms of trying to find some barley varieties that are a little better suited to the Ontario growing climate. And so we brought some European genetics into the mix, some varieties coming out of Germany that we've been working with. And this was the first year, this recent harvest that we've had sort of volume enough to start malting with and processing. So this Philomena was sort of like it was the first beer that we sort of produced for and launched using one of those European varieties out of Germany. So being that it's sort of a flagship in that respect, and also like a single malt, 100% sort of coming through us, I thought it'd be a good example of that sort of that character that the new genetics bring to the beers. So. Okay. Yeah.
I'll let you get that poured, and then I'll ask my first question.
Sure.
I'm sure that most people who are tuned in know a little bit about the malting process, but could you sort of walk us through what happens?
Sure. Yeah, so malting, I mean, in a real sort of general sort of description, malting is it's controlled germination. So we're using the grains, we're using viable grain, live grain. We're waking it up, starting the germination process, and then we're controlling the conditions around that germination to sort of prioritize certain sort of metabolic processes to accomplish sort of a finished chemistry that best suits the brewers. So we're taking grain coming off the field. It's sort of dried and stored at 13% moisture, and that's a sort of stable, sort of dormant sort of grain and we can store that for a couple of years as long as everything's in good condition. So the first step in malting is to hydrate it, and then all of those metabolic processes are sort of water driven. So we hydrate the grain, bring it up to a sort of target moisture content, and different moisture contents will affect the grain differently in terms of how rapidly or slowly it germinates. So we target a moisture content around 45, 46%. That takes us a couple of days. It's in steep tanks. They're just bottom tanks where we of the tank immersion steeping. And then we're using a floor malting process. So once the grain is up to moisture content, we cast it onto the floor, just a concrete floor, where we let it germinate for between 4 and 5 days, depending on the grain, depending on the conditions and temperatures. And during that germination process is really the sort of key period in terms of developing modification and enzyme packages that sort of will allow the malt to be sort of self-converting and producing fermentable sugars, and basically takes a insoluble grain and converts it into a soluble product that the brewers can then extract from. And then the third step is kilning. So we're drying it down to a stable, firstly down to a stable sort of moisture content where it's a sort of dry, shelf stable product. And also we're using different temperature profiles and timing to sort of develop color and flavor profiles. So a different temperature stepping regime throughout the drying process will produce a different sort of malt color and flavor profile. That's the basic. We usually break it down into the 3 steps: steep, germination, and kilning. And that's, I mean, there's a fair bit of nuance in each of those steps, but sort of broadly speaking, that's the process.
So how has modern malting changed from the way the distillers would have done in Scotland in the early 1800s?
Well, we're using floor malting, so it's probably fairly similar in sort of broad strokes, fairly similar to the process that, you know, the more traditional malt houses in the past were using. I think probably some of the biggest differentiators come down to the barley genetics, and how that impacts the process. So sort of older malting varieties would have had sort of a different enzyme sort of potential and a different rate of sort of modification and germination. So generally we're doing the same process, but thanks to modern genetics, it tends to be a fair bit quicker. So, you know, an old floor maltings in 1800 would have lasted 14, sometimes 20 some odd days, whereas we can accomplish the same thing in 4 to 5 days. And that's, a lot of that comes down to the barley genetics, just the evolution of the malting barleys, and then the enzyme packages that come along with that sort of shortened germination requirement are sort of quite a bit more significant compared to sort of older barleys. And then, I mean, powered fans with respect to kilning are probably the next most significant sort of change compared to an older malt house. Like the drying times and techniques, sort of thanks to electric fans and sort of heating equipment, is you know, refine that process quite a bit. Like a sort of natural draft kilning over fire would have been sort of, you know, much longer process, much more difficult to manage from a consistency standpoint, whereas a modern kiln is, you know, very consistent in terms of time to dry and sort of temperature profiles, and, well, not to mention sort of contaminants to the air streams from some of these old sort of wood-fired natural draft and coal-fired and whatever else.
Got a couple of questions from the people that have tuned in. Terry and Emma were curious if you actually do tours of your facility.
We have. It's been a little while since we have, like, just through COVID, and, you know, with our staff, we haven't really been bringing people out. You know, it's something we'd like to get back at. We're in the process of installing expansion, so it's you know, not something we're doing sort of at the moment. But so once we get things buttoned up, we're not opposed to it.
You're saying in the future, when things sort of become more normal, you'll...
Yeah. Yeah, generally speaking, yeah.
And Terry was curious if you actually do smoke malts.
We have. It's not something that we do regularly. The demand for smoked malts has never sort of driven us to sort of develop a very sort of regular smoked malt program. We have a vessel where we can do some old smoking on finished malts, just as a specialty sort of by demand, but it's not part of our regular production model, but we can do it.
Mike's got a question. He's a home brewer, and he's curious if floor malting versus a standard malting process, do you produce a different beer from that process?
So there are some differences in terms of the finished product. Hard to pin it down in terms of generally the basic difference with floor malted versus pneumatic is the gas exchange during the germination. So in a floor malting process, carbon dioxide oxygen ratio is different than in a forced air system. When a pneumatic malting system, managing the malt modifying or the germinating grain temperature through forced air. And essentially what that does is pushes out all the carbon dioxide in the process of applying conditioned air to manage the temperature. Whereas floor malting, you sort of get a bit of a carbon dioxide concentration in the bed, like carbon dioxide as a byproduct of the germination. So with floor malting, that carbon dioxide content sort of in the germination sort of bubble tends to affect the rate in a way that it's not been sort of well sort of described in terms of the mode of operation, but it's sort of understood to impart sort of a little bit more sort of pronounced flavor and aroma characteristic. Exactly how that works isn't clear, but it's generally attributed to that difference in gas exchange during the modification or during the germination. So generally floor malting is a slower process. We can't force the germination in the same way you might be able to in a pneumatic system, where you can add warmer air, feed the grain bed sort of a lot of fresh sort of oxygenated air. But in the same respect, it lets us push the grain to a higher degree of modification before we have risk of sort of overgrowing or sort of vegetative growth coming into play, which is sort of diminishing returns, because once you start with vegetative growth, you're robbing the extract potentials. There seems to be a bit of a misconception with floor malt in that it leads to or tends to be sort of a less well modified product, but I think that's more a consequence of sort of the traditional European malt houses intentionally producing under-modified floor malts as a sort of niche product versus that it's a sort of necessary consequence of floor malting. So with modern barleys and a sort of managed process, we can achieve a really high degree of sort of homogeneity in the level of modification that I think with pneumatic malting can be, not that it can't be accomplished, but it is maybe a little bit more challenging.
Now, I, in my research, failed to write down where you studied malting. Is that a North American school, or did you go to Europe?
No, that was in Winnipeg through the Canadian Malting Barley Technical Center. At the time they were running training programs originally designed to train operators for sort of new malt house constructions outside of Canada, using the Canadian industry as a training point. And it sort of just happened to overlap with the growing interest in craft malting and independent malt house construction. So it sort of evolved into a training program that's targeted toward craft operator. Yeah.
So what was the defining moment for you when you knew that this is what you were going to be doing?
I think part of it was in the training, going into the program and just being immersed in the art and science of malting and sort of gaining appreciation for the process and the nuance and that it was also that it was sort of uncharted territory in a sense. Like I think what drove us really and sort of motivated the project was just that there's no formula in place for building a craft malt house and a pour malt at scale and with modern technology at hand. So it was motivating that we got to sort of be creative and sort of develop our own sort of vision and process. So I think that was something that really sort of made it a standout as an industry we wanted to get involved in, was just that gave us that freedom to I mean, a little bit daunting at times, just that you don't have that sort of background of resource and sort of experience to fall back on in terms of starting something when it's a sort of pioneering industry, I suppose, but a fledgling industry. But it was made it quite interesting and, you know, positive challenge.
Yeah. So I have to ask, were you a home brewer before you decided to get into malting, or you just took a look at it? You have the family farm, the picture of the barn behind you we were talking about earlier, and that was the reason why you thought maybe you would get into malting?
Yeah, I'd done some home brewing and still do, and I think, I mean, it started with an interest more specifically in craft brewing, in that we were exploring different opportunities and possibilities for the farm as a primary sort of business and lifestyle. And I think the farther we got into sort of looking at business planning from a craft brewery perspective, we started to sort of appreciate hole in the supply chain with respect to the malt, and we wanted something that was very closely tied to agriculture, local agriculture in particular. So malting just sort of gave us an opportunity to work in both worlds, where we're still, I mean, as much involved with sort of grain growing and agriculture as we are with sort of the craft brewing world. It just once we started, as I say, when we sort of recognized that sort of gap in the supply chain, it just seemed like it was a bit more attractive to sort of work in that niche than to sort of carry on with a brewing plan.
I can see that. I have a couple of questions from the people that are tuned in. Derek himself is curious how many malting companies are there in Ontario and Canada?
So 3, 4, like including ourselves, sort of 3 malt houses, I think, at the moment that are sort of in regular production. 4 sort of off and on. There's been a couple of malt houses that have sort of started and stopped and just sort of working out the bugs. But yeah, I mean, less than 5 in Ontario, another 5 probably across between the Western provinces and the Maritimes. So
would most of those be considered craft maltsters?
Yeah, oh, for sure. That's what I'm counting. I mean, there are a number of sort of large malt houses throughout Canada as well. But in terms of like the craft industry. Yeah.
Well, I imagine being a craft maltster is a huge undertaking, and you don't actually have a roadmap.
No, it was we were sort of making it up as we go along in a lot of ways, and that was, as I say, that was a big part of what attracted us to malting, was just that roadmap it wasn't so formulaic, and we just we could really be creative with it.
But the craft beer industry is, first of all, large, but at the same time, a small little family network of people. They all tend to work together and help each other out, which is great. So I'm curious, do you contract farmers to grow the grain for you, or are you just buying on an open market?
No, it's all contract. So we're working with the same growers year over year. Pretty close working relationship with our growers, really. And that's a real necessity. Like the quality standards and requirements that we have sort of can be pretty demanding, particularly with the growing climate in Ontario. So we need to be working. We need to have a personal relationship with the growers, just to keep everybody sort of moving forward. And a lot of times there's several years of investment into a barley program before a grower is seeing sort of consistent, sort of positive results. So yeah, we work closely with a number of growers. We have been since the outset. We've got farms and growers that are sort of distributed across the province. We found that Ontario, there's so many microclimates that if we had all of our growers in one particular region, that the risk of crop failure as a consequence of weather is too high. We've recruited growers throughout the province to sort of hedge that with respect to weather. So, an Ottawa Valley grower may not see rain event near harvest that causes a negative impact on a farm in the Kingston area or something like that. So that way we've got a variety of growing conditions spread out through the province. And yeah, it's all contract. We don't grow anything here on our farm. We're not really set up for grain farming. Ground's not appropriate for barley, but yeah.
You partially answered the question I was going to ask you. So you're actually making decisions 18 to 24 months out on your production, because the decision to throw something into the ground is happening 6 or 7 months ahead of the growing season, and then you're not processing it for 6 or 7 months after the growing season.
Yeah, so we just finished purchasing this year's harvest, and then we're right away moving into discussions about next year in terms of acreage, location, crop rotations, variety selections. So yeah, it's we're already planning for the spring planting. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm curious how you manage that process of deciding now what you're going to need 18 months from now.
We basically just we take what our facility can put out in terms of our maximum output potential is X many of tons, and we need at least that much barley, and then we build in sort of crop failure factor of about 50, half. So if we need 200 tons projected for the year, then we'll sort of try to contract about 350 acres, just assuming that there'll be a crop within that. So we would typically budget 1 acre per 1 ton. So we'll contract every ton that we need. We'll contract 1 acre, assuming that's a successful crop. Then we'll just add, double it, basically.
Much factor.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're the ultimate optimist.
Yeah.
Do you just strictly do barley, or are you malting with wheat? And
we malt wheat regularly. That's part of our regular rotation. It's going in the process all the time. And then we've done so we've recently malted some spelt. We've got oats coming down the line. I mean, we've even malted sunflower seeds in the past, but yeah, I mean, 90%, 85% of what we process is barley and wheat, and then we sort of fill in when we can with some specialty stuff based on trying to accommodate some sort of projects and stuff like that.
Okay. Derek's just full of questions tonight.
No worries.
The first one, do you compete against large malt houses, or are you just carving out a niche for barn owl malts?
Yeah. Generally, we're just we're carving out a niche for ourselves, sort of defining it as a bit of a different category. We certainly don't try to compete or even sort of like to talk about competing with like Western Canadian Canada Malt, as an example, producers RAR, just in terms of that's not really a category that we can realistically compete in terms of sort of price expectation, et cetera. So if we are sort of talking about competing with larger malt houses, we'd be looking more as a looking at the space in the sort of grain storage is, you know, that would otherwise be European imports. So we might try to substitute for sort of German or British imports before we would, you know, in terms of trying to make a comparison, then we would talk about trying to sort of substitute for Canadian two-row.
Okay. So he's also curious, does terroir have an effect, and how many different sort of varieties of barley are you processing?
Right. Yeah, that's always a bit of a, you know, that's a hotly debated topic in the craft malting world. Terroir to me is more a processing effect. So depending on the growing conditions that a barley was sort of exposed to, we'll have to deal with it differently in the malt house. So the amount of moisture, for example, during a growing season will affect how quickly or slowly barley absorbs water in the malt house. And then that can also affect the rate of germination. So when we take in a grain lot, we don't do any blending. We keep all the grain lots at single origin so that we can optimize the process for that barley. And in Ontario, because of the microclimates, we get a wide variety of sort of barley characteristic based on those growing conditions. And to me, that's sort of what terroir in barley is. So for us, the terroir thing is how we manage the barley in the malt house to create a consistent product despite sort of its personality. Varieties, though, will affect, like barley genetics will have a more pronounced effect on sort of flavor and color profiles than I think terroir, than I think growing sort of conditions, soil conditions. So we're working with, this year we're working with two different varieties. One's a North American, Western Canadian variety, and one is a German variety. And their flavor profiles based on the genetics are distinct. Whereas, although we might have to process, if we had Esma, that's the German variety, if we had two grain lots of Esma from two different farms on opposite ends of the province, we might have to handle them very differently in the malt house, but the flavor profile will be relatively consistent. Whereas Newdale, the Western Canadian variety, and Esma have sort of more pronounced distinction in their flavor profiles just by virtue of the genetics. So, and then ultimately the malt house tends to have sort of the strongest influence, like the sort of gestalt, we'd call it, like combination of the genetics and the malt house process. So I've always sort of a way to sort of, I've always said, if you took say 2 craft malt houses and 2 varieties of barley. Each of those malt houses made sort of 2 identical malts with 2 varieties. You had made 4 beers. You'd be more readily able to distinguish the malt house origin than probably the barley. So the malt house ultimately tends to be the sort of trump card, but
I have a stronger background in wine. You could give a field of grapes to 2 different vintners, and you'll get 2 completely different wines. Same idea.
yeah.
He's curious about the difference between 2-row barley, and he says 4-row. So,
well, 6-row would be
yeah,
the more common, like North American. I think 4-row. I think there's a Scottish.
I didn't know how many rows. I just
variety.
know there's 2 and some number. What does that mean? The number of rows.
2 and 6 row. So it's on the barley plant, on the stalk, like the kernels will be arranged in rows. Like, so a 2-row barley will have a single stalk coming up and then 2 rows of barley on either side. And that's the extent of that, like, kernel head. And then a 6-row will have 6 rows of kernels sort of going around the stalk. So 6 rows tend to have a higher yield potential in terms of like barley per plant or barley per acre, but you wind up with sort of every second row being sort of a stunted kernel. So you wind up with, so 2-row is preferred because you tend to get more consistently plump or large kernels just because they've got lots of room when a plant's only filling 2 rows of kernels as opposed to 6. And then traditionally there was sort of pretty significant differences between 2 and 6 rows in terms of enzyme potentials and extract potentials, but like the difference between a modern 2-row and a 6-row in that respect is, not all that significant. But it was sort of, in the past, the 6-row was preferred for distilleries because they tended towards much higher enzyme potential. So you could add a whole pile of corn. Yeah.
Mike's curious about the differences in the malts, sort of like Munich versus caramel versus Vienna.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most of that comes down to the kilning. So there'd be some subtle differences in malt styles with respect to the germination, just in terms of, some Pilsner style malts, for example, will be less well modified. But if you're looking at sort of standard sort of base malts, fully modified, the difference at that point comes down to kilning. So a lot of it has to do just with timing of temperature and moisture content. So when you're drying down the barley, there's a certain threshold where the enzyme potential is very delicate from a sort of temperature standpoint. If you overheat the barley too early, you denature the enzyme, and then it won't self-convert. And once you get into as moisture content comes down during drying, the enzyme content becomes more resilient or more resistant to temperature degradation. So then you can start ramping up temperature profiles. So sort of an English style pale ale, it might be kilned to a finishing temperature of around 90 to 100 degrees Celsius, whereas a Pilsner, very low colored malt, might be kilned to 75, 80 degrees Celsius. And I mean, there's a lot of nuance in terms of when you start adjusting the temperatures from sort of just free drying to the color and flavor development. Ultimately, it's kiln temperature. There's also a process called stewing, and we do that with Munich style malts. Basically, we're in those processes. We're recirculating warm air to raise the grain temperature. That sort of helps develop sort of reducing sugars, malanoid content, and then drying from there. Like, it's just, there's all the different techniques to help develop certain sort of pigments and flavor profiles that are sort of related to grain internal temperature during drying.
So is your kilns similar to like a dryer they would use to dry grains in, or is it completely different?
It's different. It's a static dryer, sort of, it's so compared to like a farm or corn dryer, it's quite a different process. Yeah.
On a personal note, what music would I find on your playlist while you're malting?
Pretty. These days, I'm spend most of my time listening to podcasts, but yeah, I don't know. I've got a pretty wide taste of music.
What's been the hardest hurdle for you to overcome during COVID?
What's that?
The hardest hurdle for you to overcome through COVID?
Well, it didn't really impact our day to day all that much. I mean, really, it was, we found we had a real surge in demand, I guess, as a consequence. Maybe people sort of reevaluating their supply chain decisions and stuff. Yeah, day to day, I mean, we're in a bubble anyways, so it's working on the farm. It didn't really sort of impact us that much. I mean, probably the hardest hurdle is just getting back into the swing of having people coming around, and you sort of got into the habit of just being a bit of a hermit, and now I got to work on socializing again. I guess that's maybe my biggest hurdle.
Is it just you and your wife in the operation, or are there more?
Yeah.
Okay.
We've got a daytime employee, but other than that, just the two of us. Yeah.
Terry and Emma are curious. Do you malt rice the same way you malt barley? Or is rice?
I've never malted rice, but as far as I understand, you could do it in a similar process. I think the challenge with rice would be enzyme potential. So you could malt it in the same way, but the brewing potential would be somewhat different. You need a lot of steps. Sluggish. Yeah.
What do you see that's new and exciting in the craft beer industry?
Well, I think, like I was just saying, with respect to the impacts of COVID, like I think we're seeing a renewed sort of, I think we're seeing a lot of people reevaluating their supply chain decisions. I think, and I think that's positive. I think, we've always been fairly sort of reserved in terms of sort of pushing the local angle too hard, just in terms of, we've always felt that sort of quality and distinction came first. And then sort of local was a bit of a bonus. We didn't ever want to sort of project some sort of feeling of obligation to use sort of local suppliers for craft brewing. Just didn't feel that really led to positive relationships. So I think seeing the industry sort of organically evolving into a bit more of a sort of earnest interest in the local sort of processors and suppliers is positive. It's just we've always really tried to develop those relationships sort of organically and in a positive way, and and stay away from the sort of animosity of sort of local supplier, local brewery dynamic, and yeah, I think through COVID we're seeing a bit better dialogue in that respect.
Okay. Now, before I ask any more questions, I did ask you to pick 4 beers, but rather than you cracking one open and drinking it, do you want to talk to us a little bit about why you selected the beers you selected?
Sure. Well, the McKinnon Brothers Pilsner. I guess I spoke to that a little bit right off the top. Just that this was the first beer that we made, or that we helped make at 100% with the asthma variety, and that was. There's a number of years in the making in terms of investment into increasing seed, sort of from trial plots up to commercial volumes, and then I just felt like it was a really good representation of, when we're talking about varietal differentiation in terms of flavor profiles and stuff. I just felt that the style of the beer, single malt, it just very well sort of represented the character of the asthma barley in particular. So that's why I wanted to showcase that one. And then we had Handsome and long sleeves from Slake. And this was a fall autumn ale, and this is a stewed malt. So we did 100% of the grain in this beer, and I chose that just because it's sort of it's malt forward to sort of by design, so it's an obvious choice for us right away, but also sort of to differentiate from the Pilsner. This sort of reflects the character of what we'd call a stewed malt, or like a Munich style malt. Little bit more robust sort of color and flavor profile, and then the Handsome from Matron. That's I think that one was 95% Ontario ingredients. I can't speak to where the breakdown is in terms of malt or hops. Really aren't my department, but just another nice example of a sort of balanced malt forward local beer with somebody we're working with all the time. Really, high, or essentially 100% malt coming through us, and sort of a nice balance. We've got a little bit of, we do have some stewed malt in there, and then just some lager based malt. And I just thought nice sort of range and spread, and all of them really representative of the products we're putting out.
Who's your favorite craft beer bar or restaurant in the Belleville area? Because that's your hometown area, right?
Yeah. I don't get out a lot. I don't know, downtown, place called Capers. It's nice spot, tends to be sort of what's the word, they tend to carry a range of craft beers, local breweries, supporting the local industry. We've done a couple events there in the past, sort of through some of the local economic development groups, and specifically to sort of craft producers and beer producers. Yeah, sort of fits for all occasions.
Okay. Derek has another follow-up question. He talking about supply chain. There's been a lot of discussion about increased costs and everything coming down the supply chain. Has that been an effect on you too? Grains have gone up and other materials, or are you sort of contracted out well enough that you're not facing that as much?
No, well, we're seeing a pretty significant price increase in barley this year. When we're contracting, like we are making sort of acreage and seed arrangements this time of year for the, but we tend not to lock in pricing at like, so we didn't lock down purchase pricing this time last year. So we, over the course of the, watching the commodity prices rise over the spring and summer, we adjusted our pricing. So yeah, we're up a fair bit in terms of just barley input costs this year. Absolutely. It's good for our growers, certainly. Barley can be a tough crop to make profitable in the best of circumstances. So I suppose it's positive in that respect that our growers probably got most of their inputs in for this growing year ahead of sort of the point where we really saw that we needed to increase our pricing, like for barley purchasing anyway. So yeah, I mean, we're still looking at the numbers for this year going forward. I mean, I think it's like everything, that's probably our most significant point of inflation for the year. Like in terms of inputs, we don't have a lot of other sort of input costs aside from energy, really. So it's not catastrophic, not manageable, I don't think. Yeah, it's we definitely were
Yeah,
at a real premium over last year for sure on barley.
well, yeah, I mean, people are talking.
Market prices in Ontario are hard to pin down. Like it's not a sort of market commodity price sort of ticker that we can reference for barley pricing. Corn and beans, there's sort of any number of reference points that you can use in terms of sort of establishing a fair market price. But with barley, we've got to sort of negotiate it and sort of, get a fair price based on, what other alternative crop revenue potentials would be like. So if we're growing barley on an acreage that would otherwise have been growing wheat, for example, if those wheat prices are fluctuating, then sort of we've got to make sure that barley crop is competitive in terms of like revenue per acre for the growers. I mean, prices are definitely up across the board, but the way we do our math is a little bit more fluid, I guess.
I hear you. Can you share with us the best advice you've ever been given?
My head, I don't know. I don't have a quick answer.
Okay. You've had quite the journey over the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you could share with us, I asked this of my brewers that come on the show, an oops moment where you kind of like laugh about it now, but at the time it was like, oh my gosh, what just did I do?
Yeah, well, because then there was no real formula for building a malt house at this scale. We were making a lot of assumptions and sort of looking back at sort of old malting literature from the 1800s with respect to floor malting and stuff, trying to figure out how to put this whole thing together. And probably the biggest sort of miscalculation we made that we realized sort of immediately once we launched the malt house was like after, like post malting, after coming off the kiln, we have to then clean the barley and for bagging. So we have to remove the rootlets sort of sort out any sort of foreign material or husk or broken kernels, etc. So run it through a grain cleaner and then into the bags for shipping. And we'd sort of done our, research in terms of looking up different equipment and sort of projected bags per hour sort of scaling, and just completely sort of undershot what we actually needed. And I think it was the first batch of malt that came off, we started running through the cleaner, and we were putting through like, I don't know, it took us all day to clean and bag 10 bags or something, and we were just so discouraged by how sort of underscaled we'd sort of and underestimated this sort of post handling and packaging process. So then it was this massive scramble. I had to jump in the truck and drive out to Nova Scotia to pick up some sort of more appropriately sized equipment and like totally reboot, like, and but it was just, at the time when it took us all day to put 10 bags together, it just felt like it was just never going to work.
You'd be asking yourself, why are we doing this? Yeah.
Yeah.
So where were you in Nova Scotia to get equipment?
Oh, just a retiring dairy farmer that had some appropriately sized equipment. We just lucked into finding, but had to race to get it because it's sort of, there's not much of it around, and
yeah,
a bunch of guys looking for it. So
if you can be here in 21 hours, it's yours.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
If you could spend a day malting barley with anyone, is there any particular person that you would do that with?
Yeah, my dad, I guess he's he's kicking around. It's not to say that that's sort of like something that's not possible, and they live nearby and come out here. But I mean, I think that's got to be one of my sort of regular sort of opportunities that I really cherish, I guess, be able to work with him.
He's your biggest cheerleader?
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
for those,
he makes mistakes and isn't too hard on me. So wisdom there.
I hear you on that. Derek's curious, is there any such thing as like a famous maltster?
There's some famous sort of malt houses, I guess. Like, I don't know if there's any sort of superstar maltsters that I know by name, but there's certainly, particularly in the craft scene, there's malt houses, that were early onto the scene or that have sort of accomplished sort of really sort of exceptional sort of success that I think everybody in the industry sort of looks up to, admires, or appreciates. But yeah, and then there's some of the classics like, Crisp and Wireman and stuff that just are sort of carry such a strong reputation for sort of longevity and quality and skill and stuff that you can't help but appreciate what they're doing.
I'm going to get you my last question. If you could go back in time, what advice would you give your younger self?
Get a bigger cleaner.
That's true. That would have been important.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's just not to worry about it too much. I guess it'll, we just try not to overthink it and just let things sort of evolve and work themselves out.
I'm gonna say, don't sweat the small stuff.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Devin, I want to thank you for taking time out of, I realize it's an extremely busy schedule that you have to chat with us this evening. We truly appreciate you, the enlightening conversation behind probably the most essential aspect of brewing beer, which is the malt base. Thank you.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.